Hallo zusammen, willkommen zurück zum .NET API review. It's 10 o'clock in Redmond, so I'm speaking in a language other than English, because why not? Yeah, good, my screen is sharing. We have the nearly infinite list is back to being nearly infinite, aka 24, and we have red things, so let's get started on the third round of consumers of memory cache access metrics 50406.
So maybe just to start with that, we had, like, if you go down to the last comment, there was discussion between around the usage of interface. And that David is also in the meeting, so I'll let him.
Yeah, so there was discussion about how it would be consumed in the majority of applications that use the interface for consumption. I spoke to Noah offline, and I tried to explain to him why I thought that was the most common case, because typically people call add to the cache via DI, and they inject the interface into their controllers and stuff. So it seems as though to get to the background thread to report metrics via the current implementation, you would have to downcast from the interface to the concrete type, which is rather distasteful. It feels like a better approach would be to expose an interface so you can actually get the stats through the interface and inject that instead.
Well, but assuming that everyone's creating it using DI and the iMemory cache interface, they're still going to have to cast to this new interface.
No, so if you look at Sebastian's comment, we would add both to the container. So you could inject either the iMemory cache or inject the iMemory cache with stats, or whatever we call it, and you could get it that way. So the consumer wouldn't even know that it was the same instance, but it would represent being able to get stats from the current cache in DI that way. Not interface name flux, whatever.
Is it typical to only have one instance in your app?
What?
Is it typical to only have one memory cache instance in your app?
Yeah. So like normally, if you want to do things like limit the size of the cache, you have to create your own instance and then pass in the limit. So for example, in response caching in ASP.NET and in EF, I think for string-based caches, they have their own private cache. But the 99% usage of this API is you call that API add memory cache on the source collection, and it's available to your app, the whole app. So you have one singleton for the whole application by default.
I think a couple things. One thing was, I remember there was an assumption that even though it's 90% a single memory cache, like there was a case where like users might end up using more than one, but then I guess they won't be using DI that way or any other.
Exactly.
On top of that, the memory cache itself it would implement iMemory cache with stats.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then I thought somewhere someone said it's not typical to have have the same instance, like if you wanted to register both iMemory cache and iMemory cache statistics with the same instance of memory cache. That's fine.
Yeah.
Okay. And internally, if someone has their own implementation of a iMemory cache, not the main memory cache, and then okay, I'm thinking out loud. Should be fine. So like, do we internally make sure to like throw if like, because like without the interface we would just do like we would cast it ourselves, but now we're not casting anything. The user's not casting anything anymore.
Basically, if the user tries to write an iMemory cache with statistics or inject it, and somebody overrode the iMemory cache, they would get a failure because they couldn't inject the new interface, which makes sense, right? So they would have to cast. It wouldn't even resolve.
Okay. And there was a discussion about dim.
Well, yeah, dims came up.
I mean,
but I think
you guys are net standard 2.0,
need to
right?
I think we basically need to decide at what point do we start using dims in all these assemblies, and then we can like the floodgates open. But so far we've been like we haven't done it because it's only NetStandard 2.0. Sorry, because it is NetStandard 2.0 and Netcore. So once we do it in one place, then the floodgates open, but we haven't done it yet. So I think we've been trying to avoid the if-defing and doing dims only on the new platform. Which I actually don't know what would happen if we did that. Probably pretty weird stuff. I don't know.
What I don't understand is like, why is the extension method not defined against the interface?
What extension method? Is there one?
Well, that's the way it's being defined right now in the API suggestion.
Yeah, like I don't even know what we're actually talking about. So.
Oh, I think scroll to the very bottom. So I don't know if this interface is the entire memory cache with the new API, or if it's just a new API.
Right, because the closest that I saw to a thing that matches what we're talking about is here.
Yeah. So let's start with this straw man, and then talk about if this thing should also implement iMemory cache, because I didn't think it would, but it doesn't. Like I said, would be fine.
If it does, then I would do the iMemory cache 2, 3, 4.
Exactly. I think that's a pattern choice that we have to make.
I mean, a question here is why would this interface make sense without also being on an iMemory cache?
The only really obscure dumb thing I could think of is imagine you had something that could actually scrounge and figure out statistics that wasn't the cache itself, but it could provide the stats for a cache. I don't have a real scenario for that, but in theory, you're basically trying to advertise that something can give you stats, but it doesn't have to be the thing that it's actually implemented on. But I don't know if that actually holds enough water to like be. I know it's kind of arbitrary.
Well, the problem is also like if you do this as a pattern in general, then you create a mess, because then basically everybody has to try cast all over the place now. Because basically everybody has to take the base, and then from there you basically say, oh, do you also support stats, right? Or do you also support this other thing? Do you also support cache invalidation? Do you also support, I don't know, changing the cache settings or something?
Right, because like what does...
Isn't that the same thing as having a base class with all the features and bools for can? The only difference is IntelliSense tells you what you can ask for versus doing a cache, right? So, I mean, like, that pattern and problem exists in general when you want to add more features to a thing to an abstraction that didn't have it in the first place. The only difference is like, do you give them a iBLA2 with more capabilities that they can find the old and new in the same place, or do you ask them to try cast for these like new features.
Right.
But that's precisely why I think the existing BCL pattern works better, because you basically see everything in one place, and then the API surface kind of tells you what is optional and what isn't.
It's interesting but it means you're extremely coupled, right? So like if you look at how features were designed in the ASP.NET Core, it kind of has this problem where you don't know all the features in the universe on the same object, but that's intentional because you can't know because they can come from different places. So you install a different component, it pulls in a different feature, and now I can light up behavior that way, right? It doesn't apply here, but I don't think the pattern is fundamentally bad. It's just it enables different things, right? I think the main benefit of having it all in one place on the same base class is you can see it in IntelliSense. That's about it, right?
Well, no, it also means you don't. So the problem is when you go down this interface path, then fundamentally, if we can't evolve the interface, then the only way you can expose this feature is on a new type, or by doing extension methods, which then you have the coupling, but now you're basically trying to sweep the coupling under the rug and the implementation.
Adding new virtuals is honestly, having done both, adding new virtuals is non-trivial.
Oh no, it's not trivial, but the problem is, I think if you like, especially when you talk about DI, right? I don't understand how having separate features in DI helps you, because now it gets even harder in DI, because now you have to register the same instance with under different interfaces, right?
That's not hard though. That's normal. That's not hard.
But you needed to know to do it, a priori.
But the consumer doesn't even know. So the person that built the library knows, and they can do it. The person consuming it has no idea. All they're doing is asking for the I catch with stats, or I can do stats, and they can reach stats.
Right,
the
but
consumer has no clue how it came about.
But if you're so I don't really do DI, so maybe my scenario here doesn't exist. But if you're a library that's participating in DI and you're reaching in and asking for the ambient, I can do cache stats. That's not up to you to have registered it. It's up to the app to have registered it. So if some application using, how do you add things to the DI container if you're a library?
So scroll to the bottom. Libraries typically offer up these methods: add blah, right? The add blahs do configuration, and they do whatever is required for apps to inject dependencies, right? So add memory cache does the needful and adds whatever is required to inject certain things.
Right, but if the memory, I mean, I guess then this is assuming that the person who's registering the memory cache right after they bound the memory cache in, that they're doing this. So I mean, I guess if you're just some logging library and you're like add logging, the logging library could go fishing. But if it fishes in the wrong order, it's not going to see it.
It doesn't have to fish. When you call add memory cache, that call will do the needful to add both the cache and the cache with statistics.
No. That's assuming that the person doing the logging is also creating the memory cache. If the memory cache is created by one library and the logger is trying to log it transiently on behalf of another library participating in the chain, well, because when you call register transient with get service, you now need to be after the call that registered the memory cache. You can't reach to the future with this pattern.
So I'm missing something here. What's the scenario?
So you're a logging library. All you do is log interesting things on a background timer of interestingness.
Yep.
At some point, you'd like to get a hold of a memory cache with stats.
Right.
If the library that actually created the memory cache has its add doodad called after your add doodad, you can't find this thing now.
Or it doesn't matter how you call add, as long as someone called add, as long as someone added that interface to DI, doesn't matter who or when or what order, it will resolve.
But when they're calling register transient, SP get service would return null, right? Or is register transient? I guess that's a callback, so that happens later. Okay.
Yeah, it's lazy. Yeah, exactly.
The lazy is the part that I was missing here.
Yeah, it's a two-part system. First, everybody registers, and then people get instantiated. Otherwise, you would have problems with.
If you use the whole closure, and then exactly. Yeah. So for consumers, they actually don't need to care or know. They just ask for the right thing and they get it.
Yeah. So then, then let's zoom out again. So then let's talk about the interface, right? I mean, if we really want basically an interface that represents this feature, then we basically only have two options. Either we have iMemory cache with stats, but in this case, this thing should extend iMemory cache. Otherwise, people have to take both things, which seems disastrously bad. or we should really do what I said, which is basically you just have version interfaces, and then you always have one version that is basically everything. But that is logically equivalent to a base class, right? Where you basically just extend methods on the base class.
Yep. Yeah, I have a versatile reaction to adding numbers to interfaces. Like,
I think the moment we add the colon on this, 2 is the only answer.
Yeah.
Because the next feature would extend iMemory cache has stats, and at that point we're just saying it's 2. There's not an iMemory cache that doesn't has stats that has lemon scented pledge. Like,
we also added clear in 7, and so if we do 2, we could put clear in here as well.
Yep.
And my problem with like having independent features is like I don't know how to think about this, not from a consumption standpoint, because if there's a version interface thing, people, it's easy to like, what's the highest version, right? That's all the features I have. Otherwise, it's like, well, if I need this, can I get this other thing as well? Or can there be cases where I only get one but not the other 2, right? It becomes very hard to reason about what you can actually expect to be able to import.
But they're different, right? Like, one is a logical hierarchy of like new features that get added, and one is I have this capability that I can provide, and I feel it like this one doesn't match that right now. It kind of feels more like a hierarchy, but the other one is actually a viable option if you have cross-cutting concerns that can have different implementations, and you don't know what it is, so you kind of have to cast, right?
Right. So that for the BCL guidance for interfaces, it's if you can come up with something that ends in able and does not feel like you're stretching the English grammar, then you've defined an interface, and if not, you've defined a class. And the problem with this is iMemory cache is actually defining a class.
Yeah.
And so we want the class and the benefits of extending the class, but we use the word interface, which is not extensible, which, like, if we were creating memory cache, if it hadn't started before it got absorbed into .NET Runtime, it would not have been an interface.
Also, in general, I think the way to think about this is like, interfaces that have very few members, or the members are very stable, like that's usually good, which, things like IEnumerable or iComparable come to mind. But then also the consumption side is interesting, right? Can you actually write interesting code that just takes this one interface? Or is any form of interesting code basically doomed to take 6 things in order to do its job? Because then these things are not as independent as we think they are.
No, that's a sign that the thing is really like a class hierarchy and not different features. So for example, for this one, I don't expect people will change what they inject. I think people for the most part will inject iMemory cache, and on the background thread that has to grab stats and like egress to some other system, they will inject this thing.
So you're saying basically you would register both? You would register iMemory cache with stats, and then some people take one and some take the other?
If I understand
all takes the old stuff.
This line, it's basically moving the cast into the DI system instead of moving the cast into the caller.
Right. Exactly.
Right. Yep.
Exactly. Steven's asking, what am I getting stats for then? You're getting on a background thread so you can egress it to Geneva or wherever else you're going, right?
No, I was asking response. Maybe you weren't responding to my question.
Oh, which one?
That I was asking in chat. I wanted to confirm. We want an iMemory cache with stats that's being used to always be for the iMemory cache that's being used, right? And you wrote back, I don't really think so.
Right.
In what situation would you want an iMemory cache with stats to not be for the iMemory cache that's being used?
Oh, sorry. No. Okay. I misunderstood. I think you want the same one.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Right. This was the hypothetical thing that can construct stats from ambient state and it's like, well, what instance is this even talking about? So
all of them. It could be an aggregate. It could be a wrapper over an aggregation of all the caches, and it got them via a list, and it was going to egress all that data and aggregate it into one thing. I have no idea if that's real.
Mayoni could do that. I don't think anybody else could pull that off.
So are we agreed upon we should add an interface? We're just discussing what the shape of the interface is? Is that where we are at?
Yes.
Or is anybody on the fence of we should not add this in interface?
I mean, we could have an extension method, right, that is defined against iMemory cache, in which case anybody can take an iMemory cache and basically call get current statistics on it, right?
Yeah,
The-
but what's
break.
that extension method gonna do?
Yeah.
Yes.
Like,
We'd have
That
to
would have
do it
to
from
do
the
the cast
outside.
to memory cache, yeah.
Well, we'd have to make it nullable, because the cache with stats is a value type, so it's going to return something. It can't return null unless we make it nullable. And then I don't think we want an extension method called one thing that returns nullable that's paired with a real method that isn't nullable. So then now we would go to the real type and change it to be nullable for consistency, but it's weird because it could never return null. So I don't think that I feel like the extension method just isn't viable unless we change the stats to a reference type, and then it's fine.
The extension method doesn't solve it, right? Like the core of the issue is somebody else wants to implement a memory cache, and somebody in another third party wants to get the stats for it.
Right.
There's no API there for them to do that.
Can I bring the conversation back to DIMS before we go ahead with this, back to DIMS for a moment? So let's say that if this library doesn't already have a net7 target, we add a net7 target, and in the net7 target, we add a dim to iMemory cache for get stats. What would break, and would this suffice?
I would prefer that, to be honest. My only concern is if they diverge, what happens if you have a net standard 2.0 library? Sorry, yeah, that depends on iMemory cache, referencing a net7 application to the same reference, and the main app calls into the new method. I guess that works fine, right? The only problem ends up being, is there any problem at all?
Well, the net standard library can't reference a net7 app because apps are the end of the chain. I mean, you technically can, but let's not go there.
Yeah.
I mean,
Anybody
splitting.
who's on Net Framework can't get access to this,
Right.
or on Net Standard,
That
or on Net 6.
Like basically, it's you're splitting your ref set. And you now start having net core only features, and now you can still add things to the old system. It just gets, or to the net standard set, it just gets more and more complicated.
Right. We'd basically be saying that we're embracing the future in Microsoft Extensions caching, and it's on the plan that the rest of the core libraries are on, which is we're improving them for .NET Core. And if you want the new functionality, you move to the latest runtime, and then you start getting everything. To me, that it feels like a cleaner solution, and one more in line with sort of where we're overall heading than adding a separate interface that can get out of sync with the main one. You have two different dependencies to look up. We're just doing what we want to do, which is add, a new method to the interface. And DIMS allow us to do that. This is probably about as safe as we could be with DIMS. All the other DIMS we've considered have been on things like IEnumerable and iList, where we're concerned about breaking the world. I don't think that's as much of an issue here. And if we're going to dip our toes in the water with DIMS, this seems like a really good place to do it.
I'm fine with that. Would we ever do it in the .NET 6 TFM, or did we remove that and we only have .NET Standard and 7 now? I don't know what we did.
No,
You're
for 7, when we ship 7, we'll have a Net Framework, a Net Standard 2.0, Net 6, and Net 7 TFMs.
Okay.
You have a distinct net 6 ref TFM?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's called Net Core at minimum in the
Yeah.
project.
I mean,
Because Net 6 is still LTS, so
because this is a NuGet package, I mean, you can argue with Jock and Co. about policy and TFMs here, but the DIMS feature would work on Net 6. You don't have to split between Net Standard, Net 6, and Net 7. You could. I thought you were just Net Standard only, so this would be the you draw the line and say, as of now, there's this new feature.
Let me ask one more question. Would we ever add? There's no interfaces in JSON, but imagine there was an interface in JSON. Would we add a dim to the JSON package that's in Net 7 only, but not in Net Standard?
Dims can never be added to net standard.
Well, I know. I'm asking if we would fragment the ref anywhere else. I'm fine. But by the way, I'm fine with this plan of using dims in 7 only and calling it a 7 only feature. I just want to understand our tolerance.
I think we've already fragmented that in other libraries, right? We've added things to the net core refs and not to the net standard refs, right?
In particular, any type that came from framework.
Yeah.
Like,
Okay.
We have this, basically every feature we've added in the last 7 years.
Yeah, fragmentation is the wrong way to think about it, because we basically still try to make everything super subset, right? So we don't try to diverge, if that makes sense. So we don't have APIs that exist in Net Standard but not in Net 6, for example, or the other way around.
I see.
So it's still like, yeah, if you wanted to use new types that exist in Qualib in Net 6 or Net 7, yeah, then this feature is only in the Net 6 or Net 7 API surface, because we can't add it to Net Standard retroactively.
We don't add new members in servicing, right? So we couldn't add this to Net 6. It would just be Net 7.
It wouldn't be a service. It would be the
It would be
7.0
7.0.
version of
Yeah.
this package that targets
okay.
Net 6 TFL.
For
I mean,
the
we
package
can, and
specifically.
I'm sure we have, but I mean, it's all just, you know, we usually not go out of our way to add API service to Net Standard. It's just if we can get it for free, you know, you get it for free kind of thing, right?
Okay, so let's assert we're using a dim. That goes back to the same problem as the extension method. Are we changing the method that we already approved and maybe already added from being non-nullable to nullable, and then just making that be the extension method?
I mean, how would
So
we
they
have done
did.
it with classes?
The classes you return null.
Would you have done a supports, kind of like what we did with stream, right?
Yeah. So
There's
what?
like a bool property that says, do you support this or not, and then you override this.
Right. So what we would either have it be a nullable, a thing that can return a sentinel saying it didn't support the feature, whether that be a null reference or a nullable value, or we would have a, supports statistics or has statistics, and if that's false and you call get statistics, it throws invalid operation exception. You should have checked the property.
From my perspective, I think a nullable. I don't know whether memory cache statistics is a struct or a class, but let's assume it's a class for a moment. I think nullable makes sense in that you can call the method, you get back stats if you want them, and then you can check to see whether they were available. They might not be available because the memory cache implementation didn't know about the feature. They might not be available because it chose not to provide them because it was too expensive. Heck, we might even make, you can imagine our memory cache finding that it's too expensive to do the tracking all the time just in case someone wants to get stats. So maybe we end up making it opt-in somehow, and then it would return null. So it feels like there has to be some kind of, I simply can't or don't want to provide you with stats. And I'm struggling to come up with a situation where you need to know that before you call get stats.
Definitely sounds up.
Yeah, so I agree with Steve. But to step back just a second about the packaging and the default interface methods. So if we introduce the default interface method in Net 7 in our package, targeting Net 7 cross-compiling, and not Net Standard, does that mean for now and forevermore we'll have to target Net 7 with that package because there would be Net 7 apps depending on it and they can't fall back to Net Standard if they implemented the default interface method?
It depends on what you mean by that. So anybody who wants to call the method has to be in Net 7, but it doesn't mean that anybody who references the package has to be on Net 7, right? Like all the intermediaries that just pass things through, they never call the method, they can remain on Net Standard forever.
So what I'm saying though is, say I'm writing a .NET 7 app in 2022,
Right.
and like it's out of support, but 5 years from now I don't want to upgrade my app. but I want to, like, I don't want to upgrade the SDK, but I want to upgrade the package. Do we care? Like,
I think what's
because
different
if
is
the
that
new
the
package doesn't have a
.NET
Net
Core.
7 target, like, right, I would be falling back to Net Standard. Like, if we're doing
Right.
the, like, most recent version and the LTS version in all our packages, it means that any app that's still running on the Net 7 runtime, or yeah, any app that's still running on the Net 7 runtime but wants to upgrade the package now can't if
I think
they're
that-
using the new.
I don't understand what you.
That's the general plan we're on, right? It's if you're using an SDK that's out of support, but you want to upgrade a specific package, and you're hoping that that package will still carry an asset for that unsupported platform. We don't make any promises there. And in fact, the rest of the places we do that, like it gets removed from the package, and you have to make a choice: either don't upgrade that package or upgrade your runtime.
Hold on.
We do.
So,
We put a build warning in there in the package that if you're looking at old unsupported, like for example, Netcore App 2 right now, we have a build warning in there that if you're targeting Netcore App 2 or 2.1 and you're using the 7.0 version of caching, there's going to be a build error that says we don't support unsupported platforms anymore.
so to clarify what I think Stefan was saying, once you use a DIM in a package that also has Net Standard, you have to keep that TFM around forever, because if you remove it, it'll use the Net Standard version and blow up with a type load exception because it can't find a method or something like that might happen.
Right. So
Yeah, but we don't.
Yeah.
yeah,
Apparently.
that's what we're doing, at least with packages that build out of .NET Runtime, is at some point we start pruning old TFMs from the ref set, and if you were compiling for Net 7 and now the oldest thing, now you have Net Standard or Net 11, it'll pick Net Standard and you'll get a compile error that there is no such thing as the get statistics.
And that's not specific to DIMs. That's any API we added to the new.
Yeah.
So
I was
one-
about to say, as soon as you have a TFM that is higher than Net Standard that uses a new API, and then you keep rolling that thing forward, yeah, you break everybody in the middle, right? But that's an understood problem on our side.
Yeah, so you do end up with a support hole, but that's, that hole is, our public statement on it is not supported. And so then when you say, hey, I'm doing this thing, we say we understand your pain, but our pain in making it work for you would be greater. So sorry.
That's why we put the build warning in there, is to explicitly let you know.
I mean,
You're using
eventually, I would
out of life.
expect us to drop Net Standard, right? I mean, in the same way that we have dropped old core versions, we will drop Net Standard eventually as well,
Yeah,
and
when-
then it's
when
just
does
a
that
sliding
happen?
window.
Then we don't even care, right?
Well,
.NET
the only
standards out,
the only reason why we care, I think, is still because a lot of our tooling works on Net Framework, right? The compiler team has to run on Net Framework still, right? And so like there's some stuff that just still forces us to support Net Framework, right? Which that's more or less the same pain as supporting Net Standard, right? And I think as soon as that stops, I think it will just be a sliding window of Net Core versions, right?
In extensions, though, compiler's not using extensions.
No, but it's the same sort of problem, right? Because we shipped it before, and we have consumers that are actively still on it. So I think it's the Azure SDK is a good example, right? And so it just forces us to support that scenario. I think as soon as we can discontinue Net Framework all up, then it's just sliding versions of Net Core.
I was gonna say, really, it's when either this library feels it can drop its .NET Framework customers, or when let's see, who doesn't really like having that standard around? I'll volunteer Emo for that. When Emo gets promoted to director, then he can just say .NET Framework is out of support, and then we can drop.
Don't say
Net
things
Standard
like this,
everywhere.
because that means you will never get rid of Net Standard. don't block on the promotion for me. That would be a bad idea. No, I think there is I think it's just, we have dropped all Net Core versions, but pretty much zero regret, right? And I think the Net Framework is just stickier than those at this point. But I think this will eventually drop as well.
So,
So now-
DIMs on Netcore in extensions. That's our solution for add new.
Well, that's my question. So like
I'm
don't know,
willing to try it. Like, and
I
see
mean,
what bugs
sure.
come out, right?
Yeah, I mean,
That's a fair point. We should start at some point and might as well do it here.
yeah, we can still add the method on memory cache that's already defined, or that we already approved. I don't know if it got checked in yet. That can still be in the net standard ref, but that just requires casting. So it's when you're on net 7 or higher in your in that you're targeting when you're referencing this library. Now you see on the interface the get current statistics. So
I mean, I will say, like, based on what David said, like, I don't mind the individual interface either. It's just that I really hate the name iMemory cache with stats. If we call iMemory cache provider that just has get statistics on it, I think that would be fine, because then you can say, well, some memory caches might choose to implement that on the cache itself. Other people might have a dedicated one because it aggregates stuff across multiple caches. That would also work. I just dislike this iMemory cache with stats because it kind of implies that it's on the memory cache, but then it's really not. So maybe that might just be a naming issue. But I'm also fine with making it a dim.
so is
Yep.
I
that
mean, that's not the implementation, but
isn't it?
it can't be because they're in different assemblies, and one references the other.
Okay, have fun with that.
I mean, the base is going to return null. That's what it's going to do. If you didn't,
Right. Okay.
if you didn't override it,
Right, and then but the memory cache, yeah. Okay.
Did have one question about these things that return like statistics. Should the numbers be nullable? Like, how do you know 0 versus like not provided?
No, if you either get an instance back, I mean, you have an instance and the values are whatever they are, right?
If we add a new stat,
Yeah, do you
in the
think there's
future?
going to be a partial implementation other than current size? Current size is already nullable.
I just wonder. So like, if we add in the future, I don't know, like number of whatever,
Did we
and
add
that
it?
would be added as a new nullable property, right? To the statistics.
I
if we
I
had
mean-
a new stat, yeah, it will have to be
Okay.
because
Where's
it's just
the current size?
the last thing that you
Send you,
approved.
send you,
So if you search for approved,
I'll send
Yeah,
you.
looks like it's in the fold here.
yeah,
I also
GitHub
sent
is
it.
helpful. There we go.
I think you approved it twice. Is that true?
Yep.
But
Link address, I just sent on room chat.
can someone remind me why memory cache statistics make sense as a struct? Is it you're calling this method on some very frequent
Yeah.
path?
So for example, for if encounters, I don't know how often that happens. Once every whatever second, millisecond, whenever, for the frequency of the event counters, we would be calling. We will be instantiating this memory cache statistic and just like instantiate and throw away just to get those values on as a callback. And
It's following the same pattern as the GC memory info.
Yeah, but that one we realized was a mistake, and we did gymnastics to actually end up backing it by an object. Because in the next release, we ended up adding like 15 things to it.
I'm not sure I'd call it gymnastics, but it's just adding a class backing field and then moving the indirection down.
Well, that's the gymnastics. Every property ended up, every field ended up moving to another object. Every access ended up being from the property to the field to instead be going to the class. Gymnastics.
And it changed whether or not it possibly changed whether or not it was adhering to the unmanaged constraint.
What's the concern, Steve?
That we're going to find ourselves doing the same thing here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the concern would be that it gives the wrong impression as to what the API does, right? If it returns a struct, a caller might have a reasonable assumption that it's non-allocated.
Yeah, but I mean, right now we're already at 30. We're at 32 content bytes plus an extra field for the null, which means we're at 36 on 32-bit and 40 bytes on 64-bit.
It's going to be 48.
Okay.
So yeah, if you have a bool field, even with a perfect memory layout, because the other field is so long, it's going to double the padding's going to be 8, so it's going to be 16 bytes on a 64-bit system. Plus, also the JIT is very terrible with nullables today due to back compat reasons for auto layout, and so it just gets even worse. So it's going to be at least 48 to 68 to 64 bytes for the struct.
Mm-hmm.
Which is at the point where you only want to pass it around by ref anyways.
I mean, my general question is, we've gotten pretty struct happy, and some of that makes sense, like for places where it's, fast path. We don't want to be allocating, but if we're talking about allocating one of these once a second, or once a second when event counters are enabled, which is frequently, only for brief periods of time. Does it matter? I mean, my default would be to choose a class unless we have a good reason. If we have a good reason, fine. We'll end up doing the same trick that we did with GC memory info.
What was that trick?
We moved everything into an object that the struct wrapped.
I see.
Which means it looks like a 0 alloc value, but it's really a alloc ref. Yeah, I mean,
anti-pointer.
Like, I think I said it when we talked about this the first time. This makes sense as a struct if and only if we think it will never grow. If we think it will grow, it's already too big.
I'm a little worried about the growth.
And if it's a reference type, then I think one of the things that we changed with the GC info is it doesn't return a new object every time you call it. It has its own stats refresh interval, and so you get the same stats back if you call it twice in a row. I mean, unless the timer ticked over in the meantime. But
do we have a way of encoding that somehow? Like that actually sounds reasonable. Like having a stats class and then having the cache return the same instance if it deemed like not to refresh or something.
I mean, assuming that your memory cache is already supporting multi-threaded access, you can't have a thing that is a guaranteed accurate statistics. So
right, should be a class then.
Well, you can. You just have to use a fully serializing instruction and rely on the the model-specific registers to get the info.
Fair enough. You can take a mutex. You can completely lock everything from possibly changing any of these counters.
No, not a mutex. You can just call the CPU ID instruction, which fully serializes all cores. It's cheaper than a mutex.
But that doesn't tell you that something's in the middle of a cache hit. Like, the notion of how many hits have you had versus requests, depending on when those two things get incremented, your hit ratio could be miscomputed. Like, if hits goes up before request, you can get over 100% hits, which is a very productive cache. All right, so yeah, previously we said read-only struct with get-init. Are we now saying class with get-init? That there's still no reason to change these after building the object?
Yeah, I'm not sure why you want to change it.
And we're saying every time you call it, it allocates?
No. We're saying it gives you the current statistics. Current meaning whatever current means.
Which could be allocate every time. It could be...
Maybe a different way.
That it uses a dirty bit.
This class is immutable, though? Like, if you get it and hold on to it for 10 seconds, the values in there are never going to change.
Correct. Well, it's
I think we have to say that, or else.
Yeah, it's get in it.
Or else reading two properties, they could change in between you read them.
Yeah. It's a snapshot.
It always represents
a
a snapshot.
Same snapshot. Yeah. It might be the same snapshot over and over if nothing changed, but it's the same. It's a snapshot, yeah.
And basically, you could say that the implementation has sampling, right? You could say you hold onto one instance for 5 seconds, and so you only get new values every 5 seconds, right? Rather than every time you call it, right?
Yeah. Or it has, last stats, and if our current request count is equal to last stats request count, return last stats.
But I have to ask, is get current statistics going to be called frequently enough that this matters?
Frequently, as in in the chat, Miho said event counters is once every second.
Right. So if we allocate one object every second, is that going to be? Yeah, I mean that's going to be a blip.
Yeah. I'm more worried about the once per request, but I don't think that will happen. I hope not.
If once per request happened, then we probably need to revisit the whole thing here because.
Yeah, I was going to say
Yeah. I mean, it never the cost of gathering, just from looking at Miriam's PR, the cost of gathering statistics is probably worse than the cost of allocating an object.
I see. Yeah. It's a good class then. Immutable class snapshot.
Right.
Does that mean that you'd want some type of timestamp as to when this was generated?
I mean, personally, I would be surprised if I would urge us to just do the simple thing, which is every time you call it, you get an object that contains the stats. If you want them less frequently, call it less frequently. If it's too expensive, we probably need to revisit the whole model. And in such an approach, you don't need a timestamp. You just have the fields that you need or the properties that you need. I don't know that. I would consider that sort of the innocent until proven guilty approach. But I'm happy to be dissuaded of that notion. That's just keep it simple, stupid is I think a good motto.
Yeah, I'm only pointing out the returning the same reference that you returned last time as a. This allows for that, and the struct did not. So there's room for perf improvements if they're deemed warranted to the code complexity.
And why doesn't a struct allow for? I mean, there is no instance in a struct. It's wrapping an object, in which case it can be the same. It's exactly the same. You can still wrap the same object, or it's not, and it's just a copy.
Fair enough. I guess you could have saved the last copy or the last computed value and not recompute it, and just copy all 64 bytes over again. So fair enough. I guess I was pointing out it's not necessarily guaranteed an allocation every call. We could do interesting things if the perf says we should.
Sure.
All right. We have a question from
or
chat.
Make it disposable. Kidding.
Is statistics the right name for a bunch of counters? I don't have a better name. I don't remember if we really talked about it previously.
I mean, we could call it info. That's what we did for GC, right? Is it GC info? I thought that's what we called it.
I feel like GC info
GC
is
memory info.
type. I don't remember what the method is to get one.
Yeah, GC memory info, I think, is the thing. Yep.
Get GC memory info is the name of the method.
Yep.
Yeah, but for some reason, get GC memory info feels like you're getting, memory info about a GC, and if we called it like get memory cache info, that
you get info about the memory cache.
Yeah, it just doesn't feel as I don't care.
I mean, to be honest, like statistics info will work for me. I don't have preferences.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that the statistic is more the hit ratio that you can compute based off this, but the data's there, so it's sort of it is the essence of statistics. I can ignore my math degree. All right.
Two quick questions. Can we change current size to current estimated size? Because the last thing we talked about last time was we wanted these to be consistent values. And if we change it to estimated, then it might not need to be that coherent between count and size. And I briefly chatted with Eric Earhart and Stephen Choate about it. So I hope they agree that's okay too. Yep, assuming it is. And total requests would be the sum of total hits plus misses. Would we rather have total requests here or total misses instead of total requests?
Should have misses too. That's not so good. Did we grab these stats from anywhere, or did they just like who added these stats?
I'm gonna check. I think system runtime caching had some event counter.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
And that had hits misses. Actually, it had hits misses entries.
Yeah, we should have. Yeah, we should have misses.
Okay, so then rather than total requests, have total misses.
I mean, you can also have total requests as a computed property.
As a sum.
Yeah, I see. It's sum.
Like, because I feel that if I was doing something, I'd want to say, oh, we have a 3% hit ratio, which would mean I need to compute the total to say hits over total. But.
And in fact, system runtime caching has the total hit ratio. I don't know if you. I mean, okay, so we're having it.
I do have a question about the design of this API. Like, is the intent that the memory cache is going to track stats all the time, or does it only grab the stats once you ask for it?
All the time.
Okay, so
it's
tracking.
size.
Right. Okay.
What question?
It's the cache is tracking stats the whole time, and then you ask for it, and it gives you the current snapshot. It doesn't have to do anything in get current stats besides get the current data and return a value.
Exactly. When you
It's
call
super
the
cheap.
stats, it's just going to return the values that
There's
are.
no need to turn it off, right? So you can't turn off the stat tracking. Is what? Okay.
Right. The fetch method is going to interlocked increment either miss or hit every time you call it.
The size is the only one that's optional right today, because if you didn't create the options such that like you gave it of all the entries size, then there's nothing to track. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But the other ones, like the count, total hits and total misses, those we're tracking today. Well, we're tracking the count today. We're not tracking the misses and hits today, so we're going to add it. And you kind of have to track it, because if nobody asked for it for 20 minutes, and all of a sudden somebody asked for it, it's like, well, how are you going to know what it was if you weren't tracking it?
Which makes me wonder if there should be options like to influence that, but maybe if it's cheap enough, it's fine.
Memory cache has options which has size limit, and if size limit is not set, it doesn't keep track of size, and that's why the size is nullable. Are you thinking of adding another item to the memory cache options?
Not until we prove that this thing is like expensive. I'm more questioning if the current design basically requires you to track stats always, so you can return a snapshot when someone asks for the stats. Maybe it's fine, but I haven't seen the change yet to actually add the stats to them.
I mean, we could add an option later, and then
Yeah,
if
exactly.
it's turned off, then we return null, right? Like with
Yep.
with this new design, we are at least allowing it in the API.
Yeah.
So line 10 should be not the question. Well,
I don't know if you have nullable annotations turned on in this library.
we do now, so yeah, you're right.
I was gonna ask to just keep the first four. Do we need total requests like that? Like cache statistics would be the minimal set of items, and then whomever uses it, if they need total requests, they can retrieve from it. No?
I mean, if it's a computed property, it's only relevant if somebody asks for it. I mean, we can leave it out. I don't care. Just it feels like it's the natural thing to me that most people who call it they would also want this. It would be over 30%, at which point it's basically free to put it here, but we can make everybody do their own math.
Yeah.
Plus, you can add it later.
So I asked in chat, are these dumb property setters, or are you checking for things like negative values, blah, blah, blah?
Who cares?
I don't know if this type is intended just to be like a dumb container with no logic, or if like we intend on actually operating on this data.
I think it's dumb.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good. We should just dock that then.
I mean, the lack of having the property documented as it throws an argument exception for value being negative is the documentation. So no documentation is the correct documentation. AKA matching the rest of what we do in the framework. In my opinion. All right. Are we done with this?
One last thing about the estimated size, like the name with estimated.
Okay.
By like
Sorry?
the sticky point there is that you can get a scenario where current estimated size is 5 and the entry count is 0.
Okay.
Because we're not changing those things at the exact same time, right? In a lock. Are we okay with that? Is that behavior okay now that we named it estimated size?
I think it's fine. It says right there it's an estimate.
Okay. Is there a better word to use?
Maybe.
Like, I don't even know what the size is, so it's hard to have an opinion, but...
So each entry that you can put into the cache, you can attach a size to. So I could put in 5 things that are size 3 and 1 thing that's size 10. And now my estimated size of my cache is 25.
It's number of bytes. That's what it's supposed to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's not exactly the number. It's not always the number of bytes, but
That's right.
it's just a number of stuff. And
Right,
then you can
so-
say my limit of my cache is 20, and so when it goes over 20, then we start compacting.
Right, so it's basically values dot sum of value dot size. Right?
Right.
And if we say that that's based on a dirty read, then that's why it's an estimate. It's not provable. It's not structured. It could, yes, the count could have gone to 0 while the estimate for the size was being updated, and that seems fine.
Okay. Okay. Just want to make sure that like that behavior's this naming plus that behavior is okay. Because the other way can work too, right? You could have 3 things in there and your estimated size is 0 because we haven't gotten around to updating the size yet.
Yeah.
Someone asked a question in the chat if the standard version is going to have the get cache statistics on the concrete implementation. I think yes, right? It's kind of what's shown here.
It
think.
can.
Yeah, that's my assumption.
Yeah. Okay.
So if you're on net standard and you care, you can cast.
And also init only properties in that standard require that weird attribute to be added for C#. Like
we handle that.
Okay.
We've done that in other places.
Oh, so we're fine with init only properties in that standard and in general now?
Yes, we've added it in at least 2 other places.
All right, that's good to know. What do you have to do to handle that?
You kind of do some gymnastics, in the words of Steve. Is you have to, for your net standard version, you have to put in is external init, whatever that attribute is. You have to compile that into your assembly, and then in your net core version, you have to type forward that to core lib. So that way, if somebody's on not .NET Core, they get the attribute from your assembly, and when they are on .NET Core, even if they're using your net standard assembly, it type forwards down to the right one.
You have to type
So there
forward,
is a
or is
trick.
it just name?
We just know how to do it.
Is it just name based, or do we actually have to type forward it?
I think the type forward solves the reflection problem.
But you would make it internal, right? So if somebody reflects on your internals, then screw them.
Then they wouldn't see. Well, right, but the problem is they would see the property and it wouldn't have the public. I'm a init member applied to it.
Well, that's what I was saying. I thought the compiler basically treats init as if an attribute with a certain name is applied, it treats it this way. Not
Yeah,
whether
but
it's
think
the
of
same one as in colon.
of your APIs of .NET site. Like if you're looking at the metadata, and you didn't think to ask for the attribute by. You didn't look at the name of the attribute. You only asked, is type of the attribute type of whatever the attribute name is. It would be no if they didn't have the type forward.
Is that how it works? Because I mean, every other thing normally isn't type forwarded, right? None of them are. They're just all generated into your assembly, right? I thought most of the time it's basically now compare the name and don't try to unify them on the.
Yeah, that's what the compiler does. It does it by name. So the type forward would just be for tooling using reflection.
Yeah, but they can do the same thing, right? Just look
Sure.
at the name. Don't compare the instances. Or don't compare the types, basically.
Yeah.
I
Okay,
would avoid any sort of crazy type forwarding like what was just described, unless it's necessary, because we know it's hard to get right and it's fragile.
I linked Eric St. John's fix for JSON in though. That has a link to then the issue that we were getting missing method exceptions when we didn't have the type forward.
missing method exceptions?
Yeah, read the issue.
Wow. Well, I can't because I'm streaming. But...
Oh, sorry.
I'll look it up later. But okay. Are we happy? Mr. Fowler?
Very happy. Hold on. Let me change my background to show how happy I am.
But that's the happiest guy in the universe.
This is true. Who's happier? That's creepy. Hold on. All I have are backgrounds from Halloween. This is
Like the horror movie?
yeah,
Or like,
like
the season. I mean,
like Michael
holiday.
Myers.
Okay.
I mean, that's basically the face of our customers once they start realizing that stuff doesn't work.
That's Friday the
There.
13th. Jason
Hold on, Friday
Voorhees.
the 13th. And I have Michael Myers.
So it has a
And
public
Candyman.
constructor, right? Parameterless constructor, now that it's a class.
Yeah, that would be good.
I mean, those are free.
Okay.
Well,
Just-
if
You don't
Well,
talk about a
depends on what
constructor
you're
as one.
describing here.
do we put internal when we don't want it?
And normally we try to describe the resulting API surface, right? Not the input to the compiler. So I would add a public default constructor and make it clear that this is supposed to be one.
Fair enough.
Beautiful.
All right.
And yeah, we are okay with get current statistics on memory cache being in net standard 2.0, right? As a workaround, people can cast those.
Yeah.
Yeah, that seems reasonable.
Now we have to use it then. Now we can use it everywhere, right? Perfect.
Yeah, can we put clear in there too? Like,
Actually,
we already
we
put
should.
clear on the implementation. I mean,
should.
we might as well if we're maybe not in this exact PR, but
I mean, so.
open floodgates.
Like, what does it mean to put? Would you have clear be no op as its default implementation?
Yeah, maybe throw.
Like,
Honestly, throw not supported
Then
exception.
we add a can clear.
We don't have to solve that here. I was just throwing it out that we are now open to putting more things as dims, including things we've already added.
All right. I'll be very disappointed if we have to talk about this issue again next week.
Oh, don't worry, we'll come back.
As long as it's not next week. We don't need the same issue being at the top of the list 3 weeks running. Sorry, 4 weeks running. We've already been 3 weeks running.
All right.
There are no
So
red
we can-
things. Can we all go on vacation now? All
No,
right.
we keep going.
Can we do the second one first?
What was that, Miriam?
Can we do the second one before the first one? It's easier. It's faster.
The stop the host exception?
Yeah.
Sure. Stop the host exception should be made public and be dealt with gracefully. 60600.
Yeah, so the gist of the issue is that host factory resolver has the stop the host exception, which is private, and customers hitting it. If you scroll in the middle of the issue, you'll see the way they have a workaround is they do when they're catching the exception, they check the name, and rather than doing that, like there was a back and forth in the conversation. I think both David and Eric are in the loop on that. But since there's like 18 upvotes for the issue, the latest development was to say, let's just expose stop the host exception. Be done with it.
I mean, that
Yes.
doesn't.
For background is, so the way this works is typically tools that want to get the DI container in ASP.NET Core need to launch the application, run it to a point where they have the container, and then get the container and then do stuff with it, right? So EF will run your application to get the migration data from the, I know, because it isn't declarative, right? So it actually has to run the code to figure out what to do. So it runs the code, but it wants to run the code up to a point. It doesn't want to run the entire code. So you're in your in main, you want to run half the code, not the whole set, like the whole main. So like you could have a while true loop in there. It could be hanging. So we run it just up until the point where you get the container, and then we throw the exception to stop execution. So think of it like a thread abort. You're trying to abort the current thread because you already have the info required for your stuff. It's kind of cool, I know.
New .NET 6. It didn't used to be this crazy.
It's a cool hack. The exception is used to basically stop flow, but in your main, if you have a try catch around the entire main method, and you log, people have been logging that exception by mistake because they run EF, it runs the try catch, they catch the exception, and it's like, oh well, it logs to their system, and it only happens in dev. It only happens in dev. So I figured it wouldn't be as impactful, but people are annoyed because it happens in dev, right? And you have to kind of tell your devs to ignore that exception. So this is a way to ignore it in a way that's like cleaner.
Okay. But
No.
stop the host exception doesn't feel like, a good name to me.
But doesn't it explain? I mean, I don't care what the name is.
No, like,
It
I mean,
totally explains.
just most of our exceptions, my gut feeling, I'm not looking at data to support this, is they describe more of a state that has been, so it would be like we have operation canceled. So this would be host stopped exception.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Like, this is throw the stop the host exception. Like, that is completely what the code is saying. But I think that for the public API shape of that, it would be, host stopped.
I mean, I still don't quite understand like why we need the exception. Why can't we just have, an environment variable or whatever that the calling code sets, and then the thing just shuts down automatically?
So it needs to throw. So here's how it works. We run your main method, right, in a
Right.
different thread, and then it gets to a point, and we get state back from that thread. So the data you're looking for fires an event, and then we get some state, and then that returns. The background thread that runs main is still running, and we want to stop it before it does something like listens to a web server and does something else. So we need to basically abort the current code. That's the problem.
Maybe I don't
So
understand, like, but what is the running? Like, I mean, presumably there's a loop somewhere, right? And that loop can terminate, right?
It's
No, because you
the
called main.
program
So like,
main method.
yeah, you
We're
call it
trying
their
to
main.
exit the program main method in the middle.
Yeah. We're literally
Oh,
like, trying to abort
okay.
like the thread. That's
So you literally basically do the equivalent of a thread abort.
yes. This is literally a thread abort
So then,
at the right time.
why do we? But why do we need a new exception then? Why is it not just literally
You can't
thread
abort
abort?
threads. You can't abort threads anymore. That's like gone from core. We got rid
Oh,
of
we
it.
removed that because we don't
Yeah.
want hacks like this.
It's
And
bad.
now we reintroduce it.
Well, we removed thread abort because it did complicated things.
Destabilize the runtime.
This is at least cooperative.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's
Right?
like, but who's throwing that exception? Like, that's the thing I don't like. How do you inject this into the other thread?
The host itself throws its exception.
The host
If the
decides it's
diagnostic
done running and it
lister is
throws.
attached.
The host knows it's in this mode. Actually, it isn't the host. The host lets some other code add a callback. When that callback runs, it throws the exception. So the host says, "I have a host now. Here's the host." And the event handler says, "I'm going to grab the host and throw this stop you from running."
Your
So in
green
the
screen
call to,
bounding
like,
box is hilarious, David.
You can tell how proud David is of this.
It was so good. This is genius. I mean, bad genius, but it works.
Sorry, continue.
So then-
it's essentially like abort the thread, please. Please stop running exception.
And so why do we have to make the exception public? Like, who's handling that?
So people have their own code catching and throwing errors in main, and they end up logging the exceptions to some backend, and they don't want to. They want to skip the exception being logged if it happens to be this one.
I see. So that basically my production backend doesn't get
The
poisoned
thing
by.
is, it's not production, it's dev.
Sure.
Devs are very annoyed now, so you gotta.
So here's another thought, right? Is like host builder.build gonna throw, say, an operation canceled exception for any other reason? Because I'm like looking at the workaround code,
It
and
can.
they're already like skipping operation canceled exceptions. Could we just like use an existing type and be like, that's
I mean,
what it is?
you could just make your non-public stop the host exception, extend operation canceled exception, and,
That is the suggestion. Yeah.
and
So we could do that.
boom.
Does that feel a little more dangerous? Because maybe you want to log something that happened in that try catch that isn't like. I'm worried that you'll miss things. You may have a long running task that you want to log that failed because of cancellation, and they're gonna skip it because of this.
If you've decided you want to skip operation canceled exception, if you want specifically to stop the host exception, then that would need to be public. So the question is the concern they can't distinguish it from exception, or they want to filter this one specifically? Because if they really, really, really want this one specifically, then naming the type something and making it public and just having it be a thing that exists seems not insane.
So Levi had a suggestion that we could add stuff to the exception data as another workaround. So you can read that.
Is that better than checking the type name even?
I was gonna say that's as bad as checking the type name, I think.
Well, in system text JSON, I think we actually document that we
I see.
modify the exception in this manner.
So
But
I mean,
it's meant for when we actually are trying to get ancillary data back to color. Like if you have an actual exception that is this exception needs to be handled specifically, like that is what exception types or custom types.
so is stop the exception, stop the host exception currently deriving operation canceled exception?
No,
I don't
No.
think it is.
It's not.
no,
I think
it's
it's
literally
an
just an exception.
So then I don't understand why we care about the operation canceled exception at all.
This is just someone's complaining. This is their current host. They didn't want to log OCE or stop the host exception.
I see.
Remind me, is this something that can be thrown within the context of a request, or is it like completely you don't throw it within requests?
Startup.
Only during build.
Only during build.
Main.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I mean,
It doesn't seem that bad. Just derive this from operation canceled and stick something in this data. That doesn't seem like a bad solution, and then document it.
I would say if we were patching 6.0, which maybe we should do, adding it to data seems fine, and we could do that anyway. But I feel like the more natural thing to do is to be to have a type that maybe is more easy to use.
yeah, I don't understand what's the benefit of adding this to the data field rather than just having a type. Like, it seems people that want to support that sort of hack in a meaningful way, checking for a type name is the most natural thing to do, right?
Yeah. And then we document this exception and just say like skip for logs.
Yeah,
I think in the JSON case, the problem is we didn't control the exception, right? So that was the only way we can leave information in it without doing some crazy wrapping.
like I'm pretty sure that our so if we think that we want someone to handle an error condition in a different way than an existing exception, then we would make it a public exception type.
Yeah, that's the case here.
Oh, that's the case here then. Yeah. So just give it a good name.
It's if we think somebody wants to write the catch for this instead of catching and sniffing on metadata, that we should describe the condition that caused the throw.
Yep.
And so, like, I don't have a problem with it being public. I just have a problem with it being public with this name. So the people who are using reflection to figure out that it's this exception are going to get broken, but that's our general stance for anybody using reflection, is we don't guarantee your code will keep working.
I can't
what
imagine
name?
we would change 6.0 anyway. Like, this would be a separate thing. So their 6.0 code should continue to work, I assume.
Well, I mean, this is in a NuGet package, so there's you
never
change whatever you change. If they're not building as Net 7 as a specific implementation TFM, then that would be fixing 6 with the next version of the package.
Does this package target net standard?
I assume it's from
Yes, it
this
does.
is from extensions, so yes.
Okay, then mark the exception type serializable, seal it, and make the protected constructor private.
And naming wise,
Host stopped. Host aborted. Host had a cowman.
I
Cancel.
mean, I had a suggestion in chat, but people don't seem to like that.
And also seal the type. Exceptions generally should be sealed.
Yep.
Sealed goes before class. Partial has to be the last word before class. There we go.
Do we want it deriving from exception or a different type?
I think exception would make the most sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense as an operation canceled exception based on the way that it's being used. There's a question here of do you want the constructor to be public or non-public? Like, are there reasons that you want people to build these, or are you simply making it public to describe to them that the condition has happened?
I mean, generally, you want people to be able to test their own code. So people need to be able to create and throw these things, right?
Activate or create instance can create anything. Yeah. Like, it's fine.
I mean, that's now we're telling people to rely on private reflection.
I'm just like, I think that if I was having something that just didn't log a host stopped exception, like I just had an early catch so that it didn't hit my general catch everything and log it, I don't know that I would care to ever test it.
And
I like
that's a
testing
fine
things.
statement, right? If we say that people really shouldn't be testing this code, that's totally fine. I'm just saying if we make none of the constructors public, we will impact the ability to do it, if we.
So
I
you
think
broke up.
activator create instance will also fail for certain types of private constructors depending on various knobs and parameters you pass in.
Yeah, like it requires a parameterless constructor.
Yeah, because if you make it only have the message constructor, then that'll hit a problem. Yeah, we can. I mean, we probably have
Isn't it
guidance
the
somewhere that
design
says they should be
guideline
public.
to have the 3?
Yeah, probably. You act like I know what's in that book.
Well, somebody should know what's in there.
It probably says to have the 3 things always, and the 4th thing if you care about .NET Framework. I'm looking. Turns out we say a lot of stuff about exceptions. Yes, we do provide the ones that are currently marked as public. So, all right. So, does anybody really want to give an opinion on the name? I mean, if the thing we're being is, thread abort, we could also call it host aborted exception.
I think I like that better because, like, the host does have a stop. And this it doesn't come from there.
Yeah, I agree.
I was thinking canceled, but I think aborted is better. Because that's really what was going on here. Ship it.
I agree. Aborted, I think, is better than stuff.
I mean, we call it thread abort exception, so we call it host abort exception or host aborted exception.
That's also fine with me. The word abort as opposed to the word stop means that, to me, this is something that you need to be taking current action on, rather than there is an intrinsic quality of something you were attempting to call it.
Yeah, I mean, thread abort exception is .NET Framework 1.0. Operation canceled exception is .NET Framework 4. Well, really, the TPM's stuff sitting on the side, or TPL? Yeah, TPL. So, describing it as past tense is, for a similar state, is the newer thing, but I don't have a strong feeling. Aborted feels more natural to me, but I don't care.
Yeah, like
host abort feels fine.
It was aborted.
Because
so
thread abort is
now
really like someone has called, or thread abort exception is someone has called thread abort. The thread isn't actually aborted yet; it's aborting. Because if you see one, you're aborting, and there are very few things you can do because once your finally ends, you're aborting again. So it's also describing an ongoing thing versus a point in time.
Yeah, we have both kind of things. So we also have found not found exception, but then we have also argument out of range exception, right? So it's kind of both. So yeah, either way works.
Alright, so we're still good with exception as the base class? Once? Twice?
Yep.
Sold.
Yes. That was the easy one, according to Miriam.
Add a feature to bind a single element to an array on configuration binder 57325. Is this more extensions? Yes.
More
Yeah.
extensions. All top 4 were extensions.
Yeah, so for this one, I don't know if Halter is on the call. He also has context on this. Are you?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah.
I wasn't exactly prepared. But
Way
yeah.
to sound excited.
No. It's just like, oh shoot. Yeah.
Yeah, so so basically this issue, it's kind of the API suggestion here is to add another binding flag. So if you scroll down, it's called bind single element to array, something like that. Bind single element to array. So, but then the issue, as the description explained, is that this is a problem that happens in XML configuration. Because for XML configuration, we don't have a way to know if, like in this sample, what is it? TV show has more than one element. I was wondering if rather than adding, so this is one option, this adding the bind single element array, or we could rather just make a fix only for XML configuration rather than adding an option for configuration binder itself. And that's going to be related to another issue that's also API ready for review. It's related to this one is 64840. 64840. Another issue for review. And if there is a way the way we suggested on the second issue is to add a boolean called ignore element named for repeats on the XML configuration source itself. If we did it that way, then we don't need to add binder options. That's why I wanted to see what Halter.
Yeah, so I generally agree, I think, with what you said. Like, we tried to do this bind single elements to array thing in the last release, and it broke some JSON sources in some scenarios, like when you were basically like iterating over configuration sections and so forth. So, like, in principle, I feel like if we're doing something to basically just fix how XML providers handle arrays, it should be some option specific to the XML configuration source, and that's something that changes how any provider is interpreted. And then it really just comes down to, like, how do you unambiguously serialize and deserialize arrays in XML? Like, honestly, I'm not an expert. But basically, the problem I have with bind single elements to array is with XML, it's ambiguous, like whether the input is an array or is like a normal element. It'd be nice if it wasn't.
I mean, if you hadn't done it at all, or if you hadn't shipped the feature yet, I would suggest that for your arrays, you then just have a, an item child that goes inside, and so you always have to declare the array plural, and then you have an item inside it. But you've already shipped, so you have whatever file format you have and whatever features you have. So I guess I don't know what we're talking about. What are we talking about?
The original issue is 57325, and to fix that, we would have a binder options flag.
Sorry, I mean, you're the feature team. What do you want to talk about? It sounds like you don't know what you want yet, which means it's not ready for review.
Yeah, we can skip to the next issue. That's fine.
Okay. I mean, is it going to be ready for review next week, or should we remove ready for review?
Must remove ready for review.
Thanks, that's entirely what I meant. Okay. So host builder and web application builder configuration integration 61634. Are we really ready on this one? Since I don't see any API at the top.
So
Maybe at the bottom.
this is we're bringing up an already approved API.
Okay.
Stephanie, you want to talk to this, or do you want me to? Sounds like me.
Yeah, I can talk to this.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay.
Yeah, so basically, we recently introduced what we've been calling the host application builder, which is an evolution on host builder, which has less callbacks. But one thing that we wanted to look at is what extension methods exist in the runtime repo for iHost builder that wouldn't work for host application builder that would otherwise make sense. And basically, we have the use systemd and use Windows service, which basically sets up the lifetime of the host, which is currently iHost builder extension methods that Eric found, so thank you. And upon looking at these, we realized that this could just as easily be extension methods on iService collection. This would work inside like existing configure services code that has an iService collection, but more importantly, it would work if called on host application builder.services. So basically, it's just the equivalent of the two methods that Eric found, but on iService collection instead of iHost builder.
Okay, so systemd service collection extensions, yeah, is the existing type where, so this is, you still want whatever everything that it says here is, but then also adding these as part of feature parity.
Right. The one caveat is that this will not reroute your configuration sources. Basically, because host application builder isn't capable of doing that, fortunately, the defaults for the root directory when you're using host application builder happens to match up. So unless you explicitly changed it to something else, I don't see that being a real problem.
We really need new types?
No, they're existing types. So they already have the extension method on iHost builder, and now they just want to overload it to be iService collection. So these are just missing the word partial.
I think then they're also just wrongly named because they're not service collection extensions; they're host builder extensions. That's why.
Actually, no. I do think those are.
Oh, that is a new type.
New types, yeah. Just because they are service collection extensions.
Yeah. So my general problem is if you just open up hosting extensions already, there's like about half the types have extension in their name, which is not that useful to understand the namespace. I mean, we can keep doing this, but like I think it's generally from usability standpoint not great when basically 3/4 of your types are effectively useless placeholders. Because people, I mean, I said they're useless because people never interact with those types, right? You just call the extension methods, right? So you would just say services dot, and so those type names are effectively just noise.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of hear what you're saying. Like, I don't necessarily mind putting it next to the existing extension methods, other than it's like a misnomer. But like you said, no one really sees the containing static class name for these extension methods.
I mean, this is this general problem. I think probably the extension namespaces are all very similar in that regards, but I think it just makes it fairly jarring to understand what's going on in a namespace if basically you have to kind of hide everything that has extensions in the name, and that's kind of the problem.
Yeah.
And if the types all live in the same assembly, there really is no reason why we need to have them at this granular level.
Yeah, I would vote to put them on the existing types.
Yeah, I don't have any major pushback on that, considering how it's normally used. And it's still hosting related, even if it's not technically host builder. So sure.
Yes, and then a piece of guidance we have come up with, because it has bit us, is just because you plan on putting an extension method in something doesn't mean you should put the word extensions in the type. Just design it as a coherent type, and it happens to have extension methods on it. I don't know that calling this system service collection would be better, but I think in this particular case the answer is no one is really looking at these types. It's just extension methods, and we should just glue them on the ones even though it's named slightly wrong. We don't need new types.
Yeah, the more specific the name is, the more you bite yourself, I think, is the takeaway.
Right. Well, I know that we ended up with one on like the Windows ACLs that it was like, well, this class is where all the ACL work is done, and there's a thing that we now can't describe as an extension method, so now we have this like, file access extensions non-extension method, or we had to make a new type for it, when it's like if we just had left the word extensions off, everything would have been fine.
Yep.
But okay, so we want all of this still.
Yeah, this copy button in GitHub edit, huge fan of that.
Okay, then I need to copy this. It's public, so I don't have to narrate. All right, what's the current one called? Host Builder?
Host Builder extensions. Yoo-hoo.
Good.
Yep.
It seems good to me. Yep. And they're both host builder, yeah. Partial. Seems good. Thanks.
Welcome. Emo has caching. Okay, and let's see if we can finish this in 18 minutes. Rate limiter should implement iDisposable and iAsync disposable 62370. It's an abstract, or it's a class, not an interface. That seems easy.
We shipped that before, right? I think it shipped.
We haven't shipped this before 7.0. This is new in 7.
Well, there is a NuGet package where the target's net standard true, right? But you're
Yeah,
saying
but
that's
it's
in
not a
preview?
stable NuGet package yet.
Gotcha. Yeah, I see. Okay. Yeah, in that case, I think it seems fine. It's not great to add disposable after we shipped, but we have done that as well.
Yeah, I mean, dispose async can't be declared this way, but you know. Oh wait, no, it can.
Why can't it be declared that way?
Yeah, it can. Sorry, I was thinking it had a throw in it, which means it couldn't be async. But I'm thinking of obviously something else. It's fine.
Why is there an async dispose? Like, what would an async dispose do? I'm looking at all of the implementations that we have, and it just returns default.
There's more implementations that aren't written yet.
Yeah, but do we know that those implementations would actually benefit from async dispose, or that it would be unnecessary complication for them to implement?
I mean, if you're a synchronous dispose, if you're a synchronous only disposable thing, you just make your dispose async core and your dispose bool do the same thing. Like one can just call the other.
Yeah,
I mean,
I guess that's how it's actually implemented too. So never.
I mean, it says in the description we expect some third-party implementations to be backed by a network resource, and async disposal is preferred in those cases. So I guess if you expect to do some network requests after, then yeah.
Sure, yeah, that's fine. I'm just making sure that like there's an actual scenario for it, rather than just hand waving. We don't actually know if people will do this. We just kind of suspect they might in the future, because we've been bitten by that over and over and over again.
Yep.
What I would prefer to see, since I'm already on this rant, I guess, is like when we say that we're putting extensibility in for a type, like I would like to see actual prototypes in place already that take advantage of those extensibility effects, rather than just saying someone somewhere in the future will use it. And
Yeah, what confuses me a bit in the API sample is that the call to wait async is not awaited, then the dispose is awaited, and then they await the task they got back earlier. Is this meant to have meaningful results? Because normally I would expect that a way to throw with object disposed exception.
Jeremy, go ahead and remove that last async on the method definition.
Yeah, that's implementation, I guess.
What was your question, Emo?
When you look at in the sample code in the issue, in API usage, there's this call to limiter.wait async, but it's not awaited. They just capture the task. Then they await the dispose async, and then they await the task. Is this normally expected to have meaningful behavior, or would we expect that await to throw object disposed exception?
I feel
Well,
like
it says
the ODE is what they're expecting there, though it could have already.
It says it's a
finished.
failed lease, right?
Yeah.
Once you await
Okay.
it, because the way these leases work, right? It's like either you acquired or it's failed. So here, I think it's what it's saying is if you dispose the limiter while somebody has taken out a lease, those are now going to fail.
Do we still have Mr. Tobe? No.
I don't think so.
Yeah, it's you need to go ahead and document what the actual behavior should be if someone disposes it while there are outstanding wait async calls.
Right, because for the most part, generally we only have object disposed exception as like the first line in a method, but I guess what would generally happen is after you hit some await state and you're about to do something else, you're going to have canceled something, so the dispose is actually going to trigger an object canceled exception, or or then you're about to call a method on something else, and that'll throw ODE on your behalf. So yeah, I expect an exception to come out. Again, this is async. The task could have already finished, so nothing here says that that lease has actually failed.
Yeah, I think it just
so I
says
think the
you should expect
proposal
it to
here
be failed.
is it doesn't throw and it's a failed lease. I can see the argument for it being an OD though.
I
I mean,
might
because
actually
the
go
API
back.
has, the API already has built-in failure for it, right? That's not exceptions.
Yeah.
The whole part of this concurrency limiting or rate limiting stuff is that you can ask for something and you can either get it or you can't. And so why would you cause an exception to happen? Instead, just use the it's failed.
Fair enough. I mean, that can certainly be the intent and what the type documents as its intent is, that if you dispose during an operation, then any pending operations switch to failed. But as with
I mean, that's exactly what it says in the top
fair
paragraph of the issue.
Fair enough. I mean, you can't, if you're not writing the code, you can't enforce it, and it's virtual, so you can't enforce it. But it can certainly be what the design of the type is. So yes, it could return a failed lease, but it could also return a successful lease because it could have succeeded before the call to dispose async actually happened.
Right.
Sure.
You can't guarantee that await returns a failed lease.
Well, in that example usage, you probably could, but yeah, in general, when there's multiple threads.
I guess I don't know what the ints mean on the call.
Yeah,
there.
it's not time-based, it's pure concurrency, so that should be, predictable.
Because if this is that they allow up to 3, then this got 1, this got 2 and 3, and then probably completed synchronously, and then this did work, and this returned a successful rate limiter. But I don't know what the numbers mean, so maybe it does something else.
The first one is the maximum number of permits that can be leased concurrently.
Okay.
So maybe the example's wrong. Yeah, but it should be different.
No,
Well-
I mean, the example's right. It says you
This-
can only do one at a time. The first guy says, I take out that one. And then the next guy comes in and says, I'm awaiting 2.
Which would never succeed. So-
Right? And then you dispose the limiter.
Well, but if it never succeeds, either it would have thrown an argument exception or would have already returned a failed task of, I'm never going to let this happen.
But the last number is the queue limit, 3. Like how many you can queue at a time. And so that second await async 2 queues up and
Okay.
waiting for the first guy to release his lease.
Okay. Sure. It's all witchcraft to me.
So, to Levi's point about, do we need dispose async? Let's make sure we have. Do we want to explicitly call that out? Do we want to not approve this until it's
I
been
mean,
done?
they said specifically that they expect network resources to be disposed or doing network requests in dispose async in the description.
The thing that was concerning me is like I don't see any prototype that actually like utilizes this functionality, and until I see such a prototype, like I see this as more aspirational rather than as something that we have evidence for that will actually help customers.
Well, because something like Azure Management API rate, like the operations per minute or whatever their system dumps in, like the dispose on this may be that it has to go push the stats back to the central controller.
Yeah.
That it would periodically talk to central to talk about, I've just given away this much stuff, so go add it to your leaky bucket. But that when disposing, that now you need to say, no, really, you need to go tell the central now. Granted, they'll have to deal with what happens if it can't talk to central, but that's always the fun problem of you have a network-based resource and you're trying really hard to get your shutdown to work correctly when it's never guaranteed.
I mean, my question is, what's better, right? I mean, assume for a second we would only approve iDisposable, but not iAsync disposable. Then we ship 7.0, and then in 8.0 we decide, oh, we really needed it. Is adding async disposable easier than dealing with the fact that you have an async disposable that you never needed? Because it seems like if you think there's a decent chance that somebody might want to do something asynchronous in dispose, then it seems better to ship the design as one piece rather than piecemealing that in.
And to be fair, like we've been working with some people in Azure who have their own like throttling solutions who want to do like cloud-based throttling and stuff. So I don't think it's terribly unrealistic to have async disposal. I haven't asked them specifically, but you could be using some sort of network connection to. I don't know.
Yeah,
Manage
I'm
your
looking.
throttling state.
So one thing with the current design is that you're expecting derived types to implement both dispose and dispose async because they don't call each other. Additionally, dispose async appears to be a blocking call in all of the current implementations. Like, is that going to be addressed before we ship or not?
Wait, what do you mean dispose async is a blocking call?
Disposed async kicks off all of the dispose async in the implementations that we currently have that are checked in that I'm looking at. They will wait for all of the cancellation token registrations to finish because it calls cancel on all of them. This all takes place within a single lock, and then the thing returns synchronously saying I'm done.
Yeah, our implementations don't need dispose async, if that's your point. Like the ones that we have checked in currently.
Yes, but is the existence of this method going to give consumers a false expectation of what the method does?
I mean, if somebody's writing their dispose async wrong and they're always returning task.completed and waiting, they wrote it wrong.
I mean, that's what we have now.
Okay.
That's what I'm getting at.
Because we don't do anything asynchronously, right?
What's wrong?
Look at the current implementation of rate limiter dot dispose async and just follow it and you'll see what I mean.
Because we do only things in memory supposedly, right? So that's why we basically do everything blocking in memory and then we just say we are done, right? Which I think for a base implementation kind of makes sense. But I think your point is
look at the derived implementations though, the ones that we actually ship.
Yeah, I assume your point is that if somebody writes code today and they happen to depend on that behavior and then at some point they actually use a rate limiter that it actually does something asynchronously, that their code might not work.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, did they just not come back and backfill this as actually being async yet, and they were just placeholding the interface?
Yeah, and it's stuff like this, and like this is all kind of coalescing and making me feel a little bit uneasy because it kind of feeds into my earlier fear that like we haven't actually fleshed this out as something that would provide benefit.
I guess this one's because it actually has no async operation to do.
So
Right.
for example, like what it could do is it could kick off all of the cancellation tokens on separate threads in parallel, and then wait for them.
But none of this is blocking work.
Cancellation token registration dot dispose is blocking.
I mean, yeah, if someone on the other thread is like registered for cancellation, right? Like it will wait on those. But
Fair enough. So it should be using the async version should be calling dispose async instead of dispose. Fair enough.
oh, is there a cancellation token source dispose async now? Very nice.
Yes.
All right. Anyway, yeah, so it should be doing that, which is all the more reason to have dispose async on this base class.
Yeah. So I think this is just a bug.
Okay. And we're okay with saying if you subclass this type, you have to implement both dispose and dispose async because they don't call each other in the base implementation.
The way that if you are iasync disposable, you should be idisposable. I believe that we made a mistake by letting the interface not just derive from idisposable because that's how strongly you should. And dispose async needs to call dispose false. It's the only thing other than a finalizer that does.
Mm-hmm.
And it is your job to make dispose true and dispose async core be functionally equivalent.
What we
if
should
you're
do
not,
is make those methods abstract instead of virtual then. Since this type hasn't shipped yet.
I'm okay with
mean,
that.
I could see that as being kind of unnecessary if you're doing like a pass-through rate limiter or something like that.
But right, because it's many things won't do anything in dispose, or I mean maybe in this case they would all do something in dispose. But
yeah, so it's one of those weird situations where you have to override both, or you have to override neither. If you do only one or the other, you've introduced a bug into your code. Like, how do we normally handle this? Do we have analyzers? Do we have something else?
I think we created async disposable, and we created this bug farm, and that's what .NET is going to look like for until the end of time.
So we just live with it?
Yeah.
If you override the synchronous dispose that has the bool, right, with the disposing pattern, that gets called in both paths, looking at the base class has
it gets called with false in both paths.
Yeah. So
I mean, it seems almost like what you just described, Remy, should be an analyzer. Like, I mean, there's nothing in the API that logically tells you that from dispose async, you're supposed to call dispose false, for example, right? That's just something you have to know, right?
So the base class does that already.
With.
Yeah, so the base class does that, and the base class in this type does that correctly. But the problem is, if I have actual resources I need to dispose, like, do I know as a developer that I actually have to override both methods?
Sure. I mean, we can I don't think we've done it. We could add an analyzer that says, someone can put up a proposal, and we would discuss the, what it should actually do. But the general essence is, if you are a type that is both iasync disposable and idisposable, and you've overridden one of the protected members but not the other, that it produces a warning.
Wait, to be clear though, like looking at how this is implemented, like maybe in dispose async it's calling the dispose pattern dispose with the wrong bool. I think it should be calling it with true instead of false. But
the pattern is for public value task dispose async is dispose, or is called dispose async core, called dispose false, and then called GC suppress finalize this.
Right. So I think Brennan was looking at the recommendation. So that's exactly what it does. If you just supply, if you just override the protected dispose bool disposing, like that gets called in all paths. It's only if you also
it only gets called with false in all paths. So it looks like you're being finalized. So you're not, if dispose is false, you're not supposed to talk about other managed objects. The reason that we came up with that pattern is dispose async core, being async, can clearly only be talking about managed objects, or it's a very complicated native interop state machine. And so dispose async core is the asynchronous version of dispose true. If you had any logic in dispose false, that would now never get called. So we couldn't suppress finalize. In order to add suppress finalize, we have to then make sure that path gets called. So dispose async calls dispose false, of do anything you would have done if the finalizer kicked in.
So it's very straightforward. I don't know what the confusion is about.
Yeah. Emo and I doodled this on a whiteboard, and it only took like 3 hours before we agreed on the 3 lines to write in framework design guidelines.
Anyway, so
I guess an analyzer would be nice though.
Yeah, I guess what I'm getting at is like, okay, let's keep all the APIs as listed here, but A, like there's a bug in the current implementation which needs to be fixed, and B, like an analyzer hopefully would have actually caught this before we introduce the bug into our implementation.
Well, like the analyzer here would have told them override it, and they did.
Yeah.
They did a bad thing. Like the analyzer would not flag this, right? They've overridden both the protected dispose and the protected dispose async.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering like why dispose async core was overridden.
Because they wanted it to do, because otherwise, if not disposing, return. They had no finalizable code, and they just wanted to say, we've already written this, do it. We want the same thing. They shouldn't have, because they should have varied on, is this dispose or dispose async?
Yeah, so those are my 2 things: fix the bug and make an analyzer.
Right.
I mean, make an analyzer clearly isn't your job.
Yeah.
It might be hard to do, right? Because I mean, as we look at this code here, like analyzer doesn't have anything really to flag.
Right. So I think if the analyzer, so you know, I'll volunteer Levi to create the issue of proposing the analyzer, and then we can discuss it to death in a meeting. But I think all the analyzer would have looked at is you've overridden dispose but didn't override dispose async core. You should override both. And then they would go, great, override dispose async core, do it wrong, done. Well, we can't tell them they did it wrong. Like,
I mean, we could probably detect that you should not probably call dispose from dispose async core.
Should you?
Right?
If you really have no async operation, like why the analyzer's now just making you make some dispose other that they both call just to make the analyzer be quiet.
I guess you could go a step further and say if you do that, if you have a call to dispose, and in dispose there is a thing you call dispose on that also has dispose async, we could probably flag that. We could say, hey, you probably should extract that code and call dispose async.
Our analyzers aren't normally smart enough to follow flow graph.
That would mean that the call async things from async methods flow would need to look special for if there's a dispose async core and it called dispose, then treat dispose as if it was dispose async. We could maybe do that. It just seems really weird.
Anyway, I would vote approve with this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying that's kind of what you would be looking for if you would want an analyzer for that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that the proposed API service is fine.
But yeah, I mean, similarly, you could, looking at this, if they just wrote dispose async core, return default, and skipped on all the work, the analyzer's not going to notice that that's a problem either.
No, at that point it's like, why are you overrunning this method?
Yeah, so I don't think that I would expect an analyzer to flag this. Maybe somebody makes a smart one, but
I mean, it really comes down to the same problem C++ has, right? Lifetime is complicated. Like that's just fundamentally the reality of things.
Doesn't have to be.
Well, I don't know. It seems when we shipped V1, everybody thought we don't need to have dispose either, and then late in V1 they edited.
Because we had finalizers. Dispose came in 2, I think.
I still think are you working on the next version of the book, Jeremy? Can you just write in there the disposing pattern is evil and no new type should ever use it? Because seriously, no one should be writing finalizers anymore. If you're writing a finalizable type, you're working with OS level components. And that describes maybe 0.001% of our audience.
The answer is the dispose pattern is correct and will be correct until the end of time.
No, that is not a good answer. I will die on this hill.
No, so we talked about it when the book was being written. We said we're maintaining the basic dispose pattern. For one, we don't want a difference in a class that was designed before 2022, or at the time 2019, and one that's after. And the other is unless you're sealed, someone could derive you and have a finalizer, and that needs to still work because that's been a basic premise of the type system since Framework 1.0. So if you're sealed, then you just implement dispose and not the basic dispose pattern. And then this goes back to Steve Tobes. We should change the guidance to say always be sealed unless you have a reason to be not sealed, which while I personally agree with, I'm not willing to write down in the book. Unless we can get consensus.
I think Levi's asking for you to add an additional note, which is unless you're Tanner or someone else doing low-level stuff, do not write your own dispose pattern. Use one of the existing ones that already implements it correctly, like the safe handles or etc.
For finalizers, we have that. We say do not add finalizers on public types, but if you have a non-public type, it may totally make sense for your scenario.
No, what I would say is rate limiter, no rate limiter derived types shall not be finalizable. End of story. If you need a finalizable behavior, have a safe handle as a hidden field inside of it.
Right. That's not a thing that we've said.
We collectively have the power to make this happen. We're just,
we can say it from documentation and from guidance and whatever, but one thing that is common to put as a finalizer, especially on a non-public type, is simply a finalizer. Hey, no one called dispose on this object, and log that, and that you use that in your own testing, and that should, work. So,
what I've seen is more common is that people have no-op finalizers. In fact, I think system.component has this and had it for a while.
Yeah, that we don't recommend anymore.
Yeah, well, that should never have been recommended, but it's, it's further evidence that this pattern is simply not not appropriate for the way that people design code going
Right.
forward.
Well, again, like we went through this weird cycle of, well, once you're disposable, you should clearly have the finalizer so that you don't end up with 11 different types in your type hierarchy that all say go call the finalizer. We'll just make the person who said disposable implement it, and now there's only one call instead of 11 because finalizers are weird. And that was
this is all a very long-winded way of saying don't write one. There, I just said in 3 words what our recommendation should be.
right, but I mean we still want disposable types, and once we have disposable types, this is the correct way to do it, and it's that isn't very likely to change in the next 7 editions of the book.
I challenge you to an API duel tomorrow at high noon, sir. But
Okay.
yes, it seems like we're propagating a bad pattern forward just because, like, we, for whatever reason, we don't want to listen to our better angels.
We have, again, the biggest thing is we don't want this weird, like, we have a lot of disposable types in the framework. We have a lot of stuff that needs to deal with this. Stream exists. And it's better to have one pattern that everybody kind of says is bad than have 2 patterns and people do weird things.
This is the same guy who says that you like symmetric algorithm, I crypto transform, all that stuff, because that pattern, which was invented in 1999, is still doing well for us today.
That pattern isn't doing well for us today. I hate I crypto transform. It should never have been an interface. It doesn't enable.
Yeah.
So.
Anyway, so seriously, like Emo, Jeremy, others, like, we seriously need to just sit down and have like a conversation about what in the framework really does need to change in order to make development, better for people coming fresh to the framework. Because for people who've been doing this for decades, we understand these patterns. If we actually want the framework to stay relevant going forward, where people coming fresh out of college are looking at this, like, they're not going to care about some rapid application development history behind all of this. Like, if they need to go back 20 years to learn the history behind why this was how it is, like, our framework is dead at that point. What are we doing here?
I'm just, like, you're saying that we should rehash a 15-hour argument that we had and we came to the conclusion, and I'm telling you, we won't come to a different conclusion.
Yeah.
Different voices yelling at the table aren't going to make the people who felt the way that they felt feel differently, and they're mostly the people who have more authority.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I'm glad this is at least all memorialized on YouTube now for the entire world to see.
It's just
I'm also not convinced that we wouldn't come to a slightly different conclusion, and by slightly different, I just mean that it is completely valid for us to state, if you happen to be in the esoteric number of users that need to do this, here's the guidance. But for everyone else, don't look at it, don't consider it, don't do it.
Again, the problem
is a valid modification to our existing story.
Right, but the problem is the esoteric person is in a different library than the person who made the class be disposable. So you either cut that person out, or you follow the pattern that we've had now for 20 years.
Well,
plus the pattern that we've had now for 2 years.
There are all kinds of issues you get into if you go into I'm adding a finalizer on a derived type. There are all kinds of issues you'll run into there, including binary breaks and things like that. And really, the rule there should be, if you're deriving a type, don't add a finalizer. That's wrong.
That's generally true.
Because if the original user ever goes and adds in a finalizer, you've got weird binary issues. You've got potentially source recompletion issues. You've got so many issues that can crop up if you're adding a finalizer in a derived type. And so the rule really should be, don't do it, because you're doing it wrong and you're going to risk breaking it. This isn't your type, so you can't add a finalizer. And that should really be the rule.
Fair enough. I mean, if you guys want to try setting up a meeting, let's see how much you can get Jan and Mr. Tobe to agree with you, but I'm pretty sure that the output will be what we have.
Yeah,
and with
seems
that,
like changing lifetime semantics 20 years in is difficult.
Yeah, and with that, I think I'm going to bang the gavel and eat some lunch. So bang the gavel, eat some lunch.
Have a good day, everyone.
Ciao.
Enjoy.